Hey everybody, it's Cole again with Long Range Podcast. Excited to be here today. Don't know if any of you listened. I was on Monday with We Like Shooting. That was a good time. A lot of those guys asked a lot of great questions, learned some things. It was a great thing. Anyway, I want to step into this. This has kind of been something I've want to talk about for a while. I've got these two guys really knowledgeable on board. We're going to go kind of in depth into truing data, whether that's BC, whether it's muzzle velocity, different things that are going to help you understand what the heck you're doing at range when you're shooting. Without further ado, let's get started.
We love shooting, hunting, and educating. So if you want to learn about long-range shooting, you're in the right place. This is the Long Range Addicts Podcast. Shooter ready, stand by.
All right, again, thanks for joining us. Big shout out to Benchmark Barrels for sponsoring us. They've been on since day one. Great barrel company. I've got a few on order with them, and I can't wait to get them. I've got a 6 GT that I'm building off one of those JVCs, and I know I bit the freaking bullet, and I'm on the damn train of freaking Alpha taught me into it. It was their fault. He's like, hey, I've got like 800 pieces of brass you need. I'm like, yeah, I do. Problem is, once you buy brass, and you need freaking dies, and then you need all the rest of the shit. All right, here we go. We'll go down this damn rabbit hole that you guys know very well. Anyway, Brian, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself so everybody knows who you are?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Brian. I am a former sniper school instructor for the United States Army Sniper Course down in Fort Benning, Georgia. Still serving active duty with the United States Army. Graduate of, obviously, the sniper course. Served 3 years there as an instructor up until just recently when I moved on. Also a graduate of the Special Forces sniper course and a myriad of other shooting courses across the country. So glad to be here and hope to be as helpful as I can.
I'm on mute. It would help if I took my freaking microphone off mute. Anyway, so sorry, I went off on a tangent and I was on freaking mute. Apparently, I need to quit hitting that damn button because I keep forgetting it. Anyway, thanks. There's a lot of people, that are always wondering what goes into that sort of training. And I'm sure we can go down that rabbit hole another day, but we kind of had a direction that we wanted to talk about today. And I know, JD, you had a lot to do with it. With kind of an idea of where we wanted to go, because we get asked a lot. I got asked a lot Monday on the We Like Shooting podcast about how the hell do I even know what my stuff's doing at that point. Everybody looks at the end of the box, and the end of the box isn't going to tell you what your muzzle velocity is, because that's done with a specific barrel at the factory. Coming from that background, SAMI spec would give you a barrel specific type, barrel length, barrel everything else. So most of the SAMI spec barrels are between 24, or usually around a 24-inch barrel. So if you're shooting a 28 inch barrel, 26, 28, your muzzle velocity is definitely going to be different. So I want to go down that. JD, I don't know if you've ever really introduced yourself. Have you?
No, I don't really think I have. So I worked with Brian back in the day. We were both in sniper section together, back up at 275. Then we both moved on to bigger and better things. I'm teaching kind of long range marksmanship here over on the East Coast now. So yeah, I kind of leave it at that. We're doing a little bit of stuff with some friends in South Carolina. Actually, we started some partnerships with on the LE side. So pretty exciting. Kind of looking forward to kind of seeing some projects there potentially growing. Other than that, pretty much been involved in sniping for the majority of my career, kind of in special operations. So yeah, it's been a pretty lucky career to have the time in there. So
yeah, I've been down there where you guys shoot. You guys got a freaking sweet setup. There's no doubt about that. You got one of those jobs that you're like, man, part of it you really like, the rest of it not so much. But
yeah, it's one of the best places in the military to be. Definitely, there's a lot of stuff we're able to do. we have a lot of freedom from chain of command and everything like that to test things, implement new periods of instruction, things like that, and just say, hey, we see there might be an issue here. How do we fix it? Or command to the nitty gritty on, this aspect of ballistics, and we have a lot of freedom from above to pursue those paths. So it's nice.
Yeah, and you guys get to play a lot with understanding some of that where others have. Is somebody making a noise? I can't. Are you hearing that, JD?
Yeah, I'm hearing that. Is that better?
Kind of. I don't know what it is.
Let me mute my stuff. I'll be right back. Talk with Brian.
All right. You hear me, Brian?
Yeah, I got you.
Your shit ain't all jacked up like he's all listening. Anyway, so what we wanted to kind of go down is, I was before, as we were talking, I've kind of been blessed. I've had the ability with the ballistics range to go through and true up all my data, to understand curves, to understand a lot of that stuff. But coming from another side where people might not have magneto speeds or lab radars or different ways to figure out how fast they're shooting. Now, I know a lot of people use little Caldwell ones. I don't know how much I trust one of those. I've never used one. Have you ever used one of the Caldwell ones?
I think I used maybe when I was very junior and first starting, maybe in like 2010. That was the only thing that we had. But other than that, no. Other than that, it's just been magnetos and lab radars.
What do you guys prefer using, the magneto or lab radar?
So I like the ease of the magneto speed. It's you just attach it, starts right off the bat, gets you pretty accurate. From what I've seen with our loading room, they're about 1 to 2, maybe max of 3 foot per second off from a lab radar. At the muzzle, so it does the job very well, and they're now included in all the sniper accessory kits across the force. So every sniper section now has at a minimum of 1 or 2, so that they can start gathering their data that way.
Yeah, and I honestly have never used the lab radar. I know a lot of guys talk about it and they love it, and they're all talking about triggers and how the hell it triggers and all that sort of different things. And it's kind of been one of those things that I've always wondered, is the magneto speed doing exactly what I want it to do? How, plus or minus what deviation is my muzzle coming off at? And you guys know more than about anybody. That has a lot to do with downrange accuracy and everything else. And so I guess let's start off the conversation with truing muzzle velocity. So there's different ways to do it. I've heard, 4 or 5 different ways that people like to do it. Some might be right, some might be wrong. I'm not 100% because I honestly haven't ever really do it. I usually true BC and then go back and forth. But what do you guys recommend for truing muzzle velocity and keeping it within a plus or minus?
Well, first off, for us, we need a good BC. We don't go off any published BCs from boxes. We all have Brian Litz's complete, series in our team room. So we go off of what his BCs are published. So starting from that good BC, Cole, we get environmentals, get an exact distance. We're using high-end military laser rangefinders because we want that precise distance. And essentially, if you have a good environmentals, which environmentals kind of we go to density altitude, we've kind of gone away from temperature, barometric pressure, and humidity. With all those knowns, once we shoot, we can figure out what the muzzle velocity is based on drop of the bullet, predicted drop versus actual drop. So that's kind of how we find it in the short of it.
Did you get anything out of that, Brian? Or is that about?
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much the standard way to do it. The big thing with trying to true up your gun, though, there's a couple of things that you really, really, really need to be careful about. And first and foremost is having a bad range. So if you've got a bad range to your target, that's going to throw everything. It's going to skew everything. So you need to use as many different ways as possible to double check that you have the accurate range to that target. Other big thing is, using laser rangefinders, understanding just how accurate they are. One of the things that we started doing at our schoolhouse was that's slightly different from what Jeff is doing. We would not only double check with the lasers, but we'd also go out and use Garmin's, and we'd measure the distance that way. We'd plot it, and then we'd plot it into a software system, the ATAC system. So that way we were no shit, pardon my French, we were, very sure of what that distance was to the target to alleviate any of those issues. When you're doing it for an individual, it's a little bit easier because you don't have to worry about an entire firing line and having different distances across those firing lines. But making sure that you've got that accurate distance, not being afraid to change the target. If the target is you can't see it or it's too small, use something bigger. Don't be afraid to do any of that stuff. You're looking for elevation data mostly. That windage stuff. We used a lot of watermarks. We'd have a series of targets next to each other. We just have a big watermark that was a minute of angle or 0.1 MOA, or 0.1 mil across those targets, making sure that we're getting impacts inside that area. And then kind of a somewhat forgotten thing is accounting for your aerodynamic jump. So if you have a wind that's going to be incorporated into that shot, you need to make sure that you're accounting for it by removing that AJ from your solution you put into your solver, so you don't get skewed data.
Right. And I've seen, who was it? Oh, it was Frank Galley. And I can't remember who came out with it, but they had a target that had the 1 MOA stripe across it, because the biggest thing you're worried about is your elevation. I mean, wind comes later down the road, of course, but getting that trued perfectly. So, I mean, you guys have access to a lot of high-end laser rangefinders, but have you guys played with some of the maybe lower end ones to figure out what you guys have really found to work? Have you got to play with SIGs or any of that stuff?
You want to take it, Brian, first?
Well, so I've played with everything from low end Bushnells to SIG to 2400 or Kilo 2400 ABS. I haven't got my hands on the 2400 BDX, but I know the ABS. We've used Vipers, vectors, all that good stuff, and pretty much just across the board, they're pretty good. They'll do the job. That's my experience at least.
Yeah, kind of same here. You look at really the higher end laser rangefinders. That's the stuff that's going to get you out past $1,000. We played with the 2400s. We have a couple of those kind of personally on the team room. They work really well. I have a set of Bushnell Fusion binos, the old 8x, that I think they only offer the 10s and the 12s now, but those work very well too. Those are a little bit more finicky from what I've saw. But then with that new 1700 Prime that I just wrote that review on, for a $200 laser rangefinder, that was actually fairly surprising how well it did. It was a wider beam, so 800 is kind of the max for what we're looking at for kind of anything but a massive target. But it'll do the job. Worst comes to worst, guys can take one of those like the Bushnell 1700. Like, let's say, look at one of our reviewers, William, who shoots at 2400 meters with the 7 mil. He could just walk some distance and hit a few spots, then add everything together as long as it's in a straight line. And, that gets you distance right there without having something incredibly expensive to actually reach 2400 in one shot.
Yeah, and that's a big thing to really make sure the guys are doing appropriately, is making sure that they're hitting the target correctly, knowing where that beam is diverging with its aiming point, so that way you're hitting the target as opposed to hitting the turf behind or in front. That'll give you that bad distance, and then that'll throw your whole, everything off.
Yeah, and that's one issue that I'm having with my SIG right now is they've got that giant circle in it, and the problem is you've got to hold somewhere in the bottom that I've found. In the bottom, I've got 2 of them, and they both do the same thing. You've got to hold them in the bottom of the circle to try and get it to range perfectly, and then I'm usually second guessing. I always second guess myself. If anybody knows who, it's just how I am. But I'm always trying to range, 5 or 6 times to make sure, especially being a match director, I've got people coming, they're counting on me to try and range targets right. And I'm going to try and have them right. But that's one of those things I've kind of wondered, do I need to even go higher than what I've got? Because I did it. I think the first year I did it with PLRF, and it kind of spoiled me, but I don't really want to go spend that kind of money on a freaking rangefinder. You know, they're nice, but I mean, we kind of went off on that tangent a little bit, but coming back to it, like you said, the most important part of it is getting that first target, whether it's 300, 500, whatever it is. What do you guys recommend as yardage for your first truing? Is it between that 300 and 800 yard mark?
It's really going to vary, Cole. So kind of what we're looking for is before the bullet hits the transonic window, which is at Mach 1.2. So that's going to vary for a lot of different calibers. For 308, you're looking around 720, something like that, 740. And that's within like that Mach 1.2 right there on the edge. You look at a 7 mil, Magnum, you might be stretching that out to probably 1,100 meters. I know we'd shoot our 300 Win Mags at about 1,000, ideally, and that's using a 190 grain Sierra Match King. But the big thing when it comes to that distance, and you can find all this out using one of the apps, like if you invest in Applied Ballistics app, something like that, you put in the density altitude, and you have a generally good muzzle velocity, you can see where it's going to go trans and just be within 10% of that. But you don't need kind of all these laser rangefinders or a ton of stuff, a lot of ballistics programs to get your muzzle velocity dialed in, as long as you're within when your bolt's still stable.
Okay, yeah. So, and that is a big thing. A lot of people don't have access to ranges that far, right? I see a lot of people at groups at 300 yards trying to get a good grouping, trying to understand what the hell their rifle's doing. And then, if they can't figure it out at 300 and then they go to 1,000, it's going to be way the hell off. Everybody knows that. What do you guys recommend? So if someone has a range, say we're back east where you guys are, the range is 250, 300 yards. Do you want to go for a good 100 yard zero, or do you want to go for a good 300 yard zero so everything's in between? And I guess a lot of that depends on how far you're going to be shooting too, of course. But what do you guys recommend on that end of things?
So I'll jump in first. There's a lot of things that kind of play into that. I mean, assuming it's somebody who's hunting, they're looking for a specific engagement zone that they're looking for, a heart, lung, whatever it may be. You want to kind of take the best route. I'm always going to want to zero at 100 and understand, where my holdovers are going to be. But you can run a max point blank with a hunting rifle and just hold slightly high, slightly low, depending on what kind of gun you're running. What that bullet's going to do, because for a 77 grain 5.56 round, that bullet's not going to leave a 12-inch sphere out to about 300 yards easily. So I can just hold center mass, and I know it's going to hit somewhere in that 12-inch circle somewhere. Might not be exactly where I'm aiming, but it'll hit there. And that's perfectly fine for all intents and purposes. So these shooters can do the exact same thing with their rifles, just by playing with, looking at, set up a target at 100, set up one at 150, 200, 250, so on and so forth, and just see where that aiming point is going to put it. And as long as it's within those tolerances that you set as a shooter for what your engagements are going to be, you're fine. That's pretty much it. The one thing I will say though is, if you're going to be shooting and focusing on 300 and trying to true your gun, don't do it. Don't try to true your gun, because if you start playing with these ballistic solvers and putting in a distance that's well in front of Mach 1.2, you're going to really mess up that curve. You don't want that. So try to stick at that Mach 1.2 as best you can. Plus or minus 10% is what we always, plus or minus 10% is what we always say. But don't change anything if you're shooting well in front of that.
Yeah, I'll jump in there too. So yeah, what Brian's talking about, we refer to as a point blank zero. And like you said, it's based on your cartridge. So like a 308, if I want a point blank zero for a 308, generally I always run a 200 meter point blank zero, because I know that out to about 230 meters from the muzzle, I'm going to be within either 2.5 inches high or 2.5 inches low. So, you look at 6.5 Creedmoor, 6 mil Creedmoor, both much flatter shooting rounds. I can extend that 5 or 6 inch circle, based on my zero range. And kind of caveat though on what Brian said about truing distances. Yeah, absolutely not at 300. One thing we did start playing with though was Hornady's Ford off. They do things a little bit differently than how Applied Ballistics trues stuff out. You know, what we learned from them. We still primarily teach Applied Ballistics, but what we learned from Ford off is we actually started testing some truing at 600 meters. And what we did was, instead of just shooting and watching impact downrange, we actually shot at a cardboard target, an E-type. We put a really fine aiming line on there, probably about a quarter of a minute, somewhere in there. And we shot a group at it based on what our predicted drop should be. And then once we went down there, we actually measured that group, the mean point of impact from where we were aiming. Then we calculated that into, what our actual bullet drop was. And we found that to be a really good way to actually to get solid muzzle velocities, even at those closer ranges. Not like 3 or 4 somewhere in there, but if you're limited at 600 yards, you could definitely do that. Where sometimes people say, 6s, and it's getting a little close. If you put it to paper and actually measure it and then do the calculations, you're going to be dead on. We had guys hitting minute targets out to 1,000 meters doing that.
Yeah, and Neil, so the guys that run Hornady, Neil and Neil, know them really well. They kind of explained Ford off to me, and it is totally different. A lot of it's run off of Doppler radar and different things, which is great because you get your drag curves and everything are a lot more consistent that way, I guess you could say. And I guess I probably need to bring those guys on to explain that, because I've seen a lot of people talking about the Ford off, but I haven't played with it at all. But I guess one of the things that we really kind of did today's podcast for was getting the variables to put into the calculator. And that's one of the big things that people screw up. They get confused. They get way off the mark. They can't hit shit. Maybe they just suck at shooting, which happens. I had a guy tell me one day at 500 yards, he couldn't hit the target because of Coriolis. It was a sumbitch, it's the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. But anyway, so I want to get to that point of getting your variables, truing your variables, and then being able to put them in the calculator, because the calculator is going to do the same thing every time as long as you put in the right variables. You put in a variable plus or minus the wrong thing, you're going to be way the hell off in left field. So let's start off with muzzle velocity. Muzzle velocity is a big one. We kind of started it off at first, and then we kind of switched gears a little bit. But let's go back to muzzle velocity. Now, let's say you don't have a lab radar. Let's say you don't have a magneto speed. What do I do to get my muzzle velocity off the bat and make sure it's right to put into my ballistics calculator?
Okay, so we played with this before we actually had the ability to true. I think, Brian, you came into section a little bit after we did this, but we would get all our environmentals. That's key. Get your solid environmentals for the day. Have a good BC based on what was being published by Todd and Brian. And then after we put those in, we put all this into just like a regular app, or we had the Trimbles back then. And what we do is, one of our guys actually found out was, without using truing drop, if you have all the right environmentals, you shoot, you can modify your muzzle velocity manually to figure out how far or what your muzzle velocity is to get your bullet to drop at that range. So let's say I can't true, I don't have a truing drop function. I think my 308's at 2600, and I look and I say, okay, my 308's dropping, say, 9 mils. So I look on my app and it's like, oh, for 2600, 9 mils is, or for 2600, your drop at that range should be 10.2 mils. So obviously I know I'm faster. That's where I start plugging and playing my muzzle velocity manually, kind of bracketing it in to see where it is, where I get that 9 mil drop. Then it might be 2700, might be 2720, something like that. But I just go in there and I change it back out and see what the drop is at that range. If it's wrong, re-enter a new muzzle velocity and kind of analog true, as opposed to putting in all my metrics and then having it pop out a number for me.
That's the thing is that it's too easy. There's too many of these ballistic apps that are free to download, and then you can pay for add-ons, but it's too easy to just get one. It makes life 1,000 times easier for you. It allows you to do all these things now. So in reality, you can take the time and do it correctly, and then get better solutions. Put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. Put good stuff in, you're going to get good stuff out. So take the time. You can do it. Like Jeff said, that is what we did. We had to do it the old-fashioned way. Shoot, we did it when I went through sniper school. We sat there and we just manually did everything with the little HRAG until we had our correct muzzle velocity, and that's what we saved and used. We validated. So, yeah, it's very doable.
So I guess let's kind of dumb that down for some people, and I don't take it as you're dumb because you don't understand it. But put a target at 300 yards. You understand that at 300 yards with a 308, it's supposed to do this, and then you can go back to that MOA truing bar that you guys talked about and understand where it's hitting on that. Is that usually the best way to do it? With the truing bar, and using a pretty good plate, because again, wind isn't that big of a factor while you're trying to do that. What is that kind of the best way that you would find to do it?
Biggest thing with our truing bars is we have ours at half minute, and it's a little bit different than kind of what Brian does, or what they do at his schoolhouse, and that's just because we want the smallest aiming point we can. And we found that if we have a half-minute truing bar, we can get them to refine their drop to within about a quarter of a minute. Kind of like they're aiming at the top of the truing bar, their mean point of impact is center. I know they're a quarter minute lower than where their dope's at or where their data's at. So if you can use a smaller thing to shoot at, that's ideal. Like, man, back in the day, we used to shoot at shotgun pigeons, Brian? Out back
like 1,000.
Yeah, exactly. Out of the side of the hill, and those are phenomenal. It's so much fun to shoot at those.
Oh, yeah.
And you get good truing out of it as well. So little things like that. I mean, we just try and stress the smaller the target, the better, as long as you can maintain a good mean point of impact and identify it on what you're shooting.
Yeah, and I guess that's one thing that I want to kind of point out to a lot of the listeners is I see this a ton where they'll hit what they're aiming at and they call it good. Go back and make sure that you really are. You didn't get freaking lucky. You didn't jerk it into there. You didn't pull it into there. How many shots would you guys recommend trying to get into there before you call it 100%? Like 5 shots, 10 shots?
Yeah, 5 is super ideal. The majority of the time, so if we're talking about truing, 5 might be a little bit more difficult depending on the caliber and what distances you're at. So typically 3 would be pretty good as long as they're within the tolerance. Now, Jeff's talking about, quarter minute of angle size target. We always tried to use, 1/10 of a mil. So we'd have a 1/10 of a mil tall, watermark on there as their aiming point. And as long as they were all impacting there, we called that good. But you want it to be within those tolerances. And like you talked about, you want it to be at your point of aim. You want that point of aim to line up with that point of impact. What do you got, Jeff?
No, same thing. I mean, one thing for everyone who's kind of looking at shooting at these distances and they're like, oh man, 700 meters, that's a long way. I can't keep my group inside that, that 0.1 mil or that, quarter minute target. That's not what we're talking about. We want the mean point of impact right there. So once we get our guys dialed in on that mean point of impact, we have them shoot 5 rounds. We're pretty unforgiving about making them do that, just to make sure that if one of those rounds is a flyer, they can call that flyer and they know to discount it. So then they can confirm that, hey, with that flyer, their data is still good. With 3 rounds, if you're more experienced, I'd say, yeah, that's fine. But if you're a newer shooter, I'd invest the 5 rounds. It'll solve a lot of headaches later on down the road.
So, and what do you guys recommend maybe going back through and just double checking your truing, even though you're using a magneto speed or a lab radar to try and get that, and that's one thing maybe I need to start doing better, because I always are like, oh, well, this told me, so that it must be gospel because it said it. And maybe that's something I probably need to work on as well, because I've gotten so used to using electronics to figure that shit out. It can just pull one of those many excuses off the table of why the hell I missed a target, right? So I got a whole long list of freaking what we went into it. Now,
I think we all have those lists, right?
Yeah, that's no kidding. You guys get to shoot a lot, though. Some of my guns, just like these back here, I just use them for wall hangers. That's all they do anymore. It's freaking ridiculous.
They're just 3D printed models.
No, that's the new Macmillan Z10, the blue one.
That looks
They're cool stocks. The new Z1 is probably my favorite. It's on my Voodoo right now, and it might be like getting lost in a horrible boating accident. We'll see what happens with it. But
I think that's happened on mine too.
Yeah, I'm sure.
All
Yeah,
these books going down.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we do that too. We've found a few magnetos that are actually off. So if we have a student that's getting a bad muzzle velocity, we're going to have them re-true, and if their magneto is the one that's off, we actually mark it and we pull it from all the magnetos that we're using, so they don't use them once, or they don't use that one if we found that it's bad. But generally speaking, we see really good stuff with magnetos. But yeah, we do have them confirm via true. So
yeah, that's like one of the first things that you do. So they just rewrote the .40, which is what the Army uses for all its training, and they have a section for sniper, and it needs to get a little bit of rewording done. But truing is one of the first things that you do right after you zero. Get your good solid zero. Make sure your point of aim is where your point of impact is. It's within the tolerances of what that gun can shoot, if not smaller. And you step out, true. With the new calibers that we're getting pretty soon, it's going to be a little bit tricky because not many ranges in the Army have the distances that big guys are going to need. But that's an issue that we'll cover, another day. But yes, absolutely true. Absolutely, it helps you, and it makes that curve line up a lot better.
Change number 300.4-5 caliber change. I was talking.
exactly.
I think it was on a podcast with you last week when I was talking about that mod 1 load I did that we worked on for the U.S. Army. Son of a bitch! I wish I still had all that. That shit was a laser beam, except I didn't have extractors when I was done. Right there. 220. It seriously was. It was like 50 with a 220. Yeah, it was
I saw that. I saw that when I went to Marsoc's course. Like I was amazed. I was like, oh, this 220 is awesome. And then we started hearing about, but it might not extract.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, we'll just shelve this stuff.
Yeah, I remember one of the first matches I ever shot with that shit, man. I was raining havoc on their poor targets. I mean, I was pushing a freaking bullet pretty quick. But yeah, that was interesting. So you've trued your muzzle velocity. Now you trust the BC from Applied Ballistics. Is there any other BCs? You just go straight to Applied Ballistics, get the BC, input it, and you're good. Are you guys truing that also, or are you just taking that as gospel to use the BC that's put in from AB?
Yeah, I'll start that. Yeah, we're trusting Applied Ballistics and then Hornady too. Those are the only two entities that do Doppler testing that we know of right now that have cataloged all their bullets, generally speaking. So with all the science that's behind kind of what we're getting, we trust it. And then we actually start guys off on G1s and G7s a little bit for the first 2 weeks. But then after that, we go straight to custom drag curve, which is really where the Doppler testing comes in. But if Brian publishes it or if Hornady publishes it, I trust that BC.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. For the most part, we would just start off with the custom drag model for the 175 grain Sierra Match Kings, the 308s, because you're not you're not rating it against anything else. You're not rating it against that G1 projectile, which is really good for your older, round nose projectiles, whereas your G7 is more for the modern shape projectiles. But that custom drag model is rating it against itself. They have all the data on how it performs. Why not use that to your advantage? So that's typically how we would run it. And it's usually very successful.
Yeah, that's one of the funny things that a lot of people don't know, and I think it was Barnes' fault for not knowing, for letting people know. Barnes was one of the only ballistics companies in the world that was doing Doppler radar. Nobody knew that. There was us, and I believe there was Crane. There was two. So like it was funny because like other companies would show up in Barnes Ballistics Lab, and I'm like, what the hell are they doing here? They're like, oh, they can't test Doppler radar. Randy was one of the first people. So Randy Brooks was the brains behind the Barnes triple shocks and everything. He figured out a way to make the Doppler radar work inside the tunnels, which was crazy. Everybody's like, "Oh, you can't do that," because we had a 300-yard indoor tunnel, and so we started doing that. But that was one of the coolest things about working there. It was my camera shoot 140 match burner. It's this BC to this, and then it's this BC to this, and like we tracked it for over a mile, and I could put in all of my own custom drag curves in there. And then I really knew it was my freaking fault for missing shit, because all the stuff was like, Ailer system sighting in and everything. All my excuses were out the freaking window. And that was one of the cool things about working there and understanding that. But a lot of people don't understand what even Doppler radar is. Can you guys explain that, or should I explain it? You guys probably have a pretty good idea what Doppler radar does, though.
I mean, I'm not a super scientist. If Jeff's got a better explanation than I do, it's just radar that is continuously shot. So as the bullet is, flying, it's being tracked the entire way. It's getting continuous pings all the way until it hits the ground. The AB guys came out to, I want to say, not this most recent ELR comp that I went to, but one in October. They came out and they brought their mobile lab. Excuse me, it was for the Precision Rifle Expo. They came out and they brought it out, and they were running, people's personal guns, building them personal drag models, and it was awesome. So yeah, it's a great tool, and it's very, very, very important because it allows you to see what that bullet's doing at every stage of its flight, and they can track it and create data, hard data. So
yeah, I got you. So we again, before we went live, we talked about going through your variable inputs, because even getting them off a little bit is going to be a huge freaking factor in you engaging targets. So we've talked about truing muzzle velocity. We've talked about BC. What is the next step in your guys' goal of putting it into the Kestrel or whatever you're using?
I put in environmentals. Make sure the density altitude is where everything's updated kind of right before I shoot. Some guys let it sit and they don't do much to change it, 10, 15, 20 minutes later. But if I'm truing, I'm updating my environmentals right before I take that series of shots. And then I'm going right off of that.
Yeah. The Kestrel is a great tool. It really is. It's probably one of the biggest game changers that, I think, Jeff, we've seen, in our time shooting. It's such a great piece of equipment, but like I keep talking about, you put garbage in it, you're going to get garbage out. One thing to kind of take note of is that there's 11 variables that go into the Kestrel that can throw your solutions off wildly. I'll list them for everybody, and if somebody wants to type it at some point, I can type it up. But first and foremost, your muzzle velocity. If your muzzle velocity is off, obviously you're going to have a bad solution. Next, if your BC is off, if your ballistic coefficient is off, you're going to have issues hitting your target. Your density altitude. So your density altitude, like Jeff, they use it a lot. We also start to use it because it's a nice medium. It combines three variables into one. So that way you're getting a more uniform solution, regardless of what the actual temperature, elevation, or whatever it may be. It's easier to use. So if your density altitude's off, you're going to have a problem. Your AJ, if you have your AJ on as opposed to off, you can have an issue with that. Then your inclination degree. So if your inclination degree, if you have it put in that you're shooting uphill or downhill, that can change things pretty wildly. So it's going to take that into account. Then if you have a bad DSF, if you started playing with your drop scale factor and not taking note of it, that can mess things up. Your direction of fire, obviously, that comes more into your vertical Coriolis and your horizontal Coriolis, but having your direction of fire off can throw things off occasionally, depending on what you're shooting at. Lastly, then you got your bore height. If you have an improper bore height that's wildly off, it can throw you off. Your zero range, obviously, if you don't have it in, if you put in meters instead of yards, that's the next thing is actually yards and meters. If you have those two mixed up, that's where you're going to have a lot of issues. I've experienced that personally at ELR competitions, and it's not fun trying to say, why am I flying over the target? It's only at 1,600 yards. Oh, I'm in meters. And then lastly, if you have a headwind or a tailwind put into the Kestrel, all those things, if you check those 11 things, if you're having an issue with your Kestrel, 99.9% of the time, that's going to solve it. You just got to go through and make sure that none of those things are off. And once you do, you're good. But there's a lot of tools that you can use. Kestrel's probably the easiest one to use. So it's this thing. It goes everywhere with me. I take it, on when we're walking the dogs. I'll pull it out and grab some wind readings. My wife will look at me like I'm crazy, and I'll guess the wind speeds. But it's made me a hell of a lot better.
Yeah, and we talked about that a couple weeks ago with Emil Praslik. JD was on there with him. I've heard that from a lot of people where they'll walk around with their Kestrel and just kind of test. One thing I want to talk about is in a lot of the apps, they'll pull environmentals for you. I always used Straylock Plus and different things. And I think what a lot of shooters don't understand is they will pull from a weather station, but where the hell is the weather station at? That's a big thing. What do you guys recommend? So they can't afford a Kestrel. They're trying to figure out, are you just going to trust the weather station, or what do you guys recommend for inputting? Because you can input your own variables or trust the weather station, right? So what do you guys recommend for that?
Yeah, Jeff, go ahead. Take this one. I want to hear your answer.
So kind of two things. So yeah, the higher end ballistics Kestrels that we have, they're fairly pricey. Yeah, no doubt. You can actually pick up just a regular old Kestrel without any ballistics in it for a fairly good price. So if guys, have $200 they can spend on that, definitely do it. I know if you hit up Thuls, THULES, or maybe Noe, I'm not 100% sure. They did the data books for the MARSOC course, and one of the really cool things they had was they had a chart on the front of the book, and it was temperature and it was your map altitude. And from those two factors right there, it gave you a ballpark density altitude. And what we found is that as long as you're within essentially 1,000 feet, you're good. It's not going to make that much of a difference, especially at a truing distance. You might be off by like 0.05 mils. So for a guy in minutes, that would be like 1/6 of a minute. Be off something like that, or a third of a minute. Yeah, a sixth of a minute, I think. So I don't know if they publish that, but guys can get a hold of them and see if they'll send out that sheet on density altitude. Then there, it's just, hey, what's the temperature right now, and what's my map altitude, and I'm good with my density altitude.
Right. And one thing, Justin Heyer, one of the reviewers, he posted something on the tactics page the other day about using a temperature probe. And I'm like, hell, I even never thought of that, because with your Kestrel, you've got to take it out, you got to fling it around, you got to try and get it, if it's stuffed in your pocket or in your pack or something, you got to try and get it used to whatever, your temperature is, if you're not using density altitude, or even if you just want temperature. But it was amazing because he's like, I just pulled this out within 5 minutes or less than, it was just like under a minute. He could figure out exactly what the temperature was. And I'm like, well, hell, I never thought of that. I'm like, that was really simple to use that. And you can just store it right there in your thing. It's just a little temperature probe. And I'm like, well, crap, that's a great idea. I never even thought of that. But so what is, and you kind of hit on it a little bit, and this has always been a question of mine in the back of my head, plus or minus what will throw off it, because say you're at a competition, you've taken your DA in the morning, and you start shooting. Are you guys taking DA in between every stage, or are you waiting a couple hours, updating DA, and then going to try and figure it out? Like what are you guys trying to figure out plus or minus in the variables there? Because the variables, of course, have a lot to do when you hitting an 800-yard target or whatever it is.
So the rule of thumb that I always go with is if I got to put on a layer of clothing or take off a layer of clothing, I'm going to update my Kestrel, get live atmospherics. That's a general rule of thumb. If I'm at a competition, so for ELR, I get a lot of downtime between, courses of fire. I'll sit there with my Kestrel and I'll be constantly pumping it, seeing what it's doing. And then about 5 minutes before it's my turn to shoot, I'll update it right there. So I know it's very, very, very rarely going to change between the 5 minutes I just took it and when I'm actually firing. And that's usually pretty good. But general rule of thumb, if I'm just, if I need to put on a layer of clothing or take off a layer of clothing, that's pretty, that's when I'm going to update something to the point where it's going to throw me off if I didn't. And I've got the Applied Ballistics analytics software up, so I mean we can actually look at just how much density altitude throws us off, just based off of inputs that we have. It's pretty simple to see, but I think the rule of thumb is about 1,000 foot. If you're within 1,000, you'll be fine.
All right, and maybe you answered that, but we got to ask, what is the number for DA change? Like every 20, every 40, like what is the variable there?
I mean, a real solid. So most of the guys that I know that on the operational side, they'll run 1,000 to 1,500 foot DA cards. The really hyper analytical guys will run 500 foot. So I mean, you can go 500 foot DA and not see a massive change between your next step of 500 foot. So 500 to 1,000 is very accurate. You can make it much more precise, but you're going to see just by building it, it doesn't do a whole lot more than you think it does in reality.
Yeah, and I mean that's along the lines of one of those things, like just even when you're out, messing around during the day, shooting, with the buddies, practicing or whatever, messing with, the different steps there and seeing where it really starts to change your variables, because that's one of those biggest things of mine is at what point does that change, and a lot of that is depending on a lot of different things, but that's one thing that I've kind of tried to do is, while I'm out shooting and practicing, to try and figure out where I need to mentally change those to go through it. Now, a lot of people get really mental with it and they're updating it constantly all the time, all day long. I've seen shooters do it all the time. And I almost think that in the brain game of things, I almost think that gets in people's heads when they're trying to update it so much, which is a good thing. Why we're kind of going down this road of explaining, how much of that comes into effect of what it is. Now, temperature and different things are totally different. And of course, we coming back to density altitude. So if they're not using density altitude, which, most of the Kestrels and everything have now, what variables do they really need to focus on? Temperature, humidity, different things like that. How would somebody that doesn't have density altitude, what do they need to make sure they're focusing on and not over focusing on, if that makes sense?
You want to go, Jeff?
I'd have them focus on temperature and barometric pressure. Humidity is kind of it's kind of a non-issue except in kind of ELR situations. So I've I pulled up one of Williams' guns, actually, is 7 mil, and I put it at $1,000. So I'm sitting here at 71 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's giving me 9.82 mils of elevation to hit the target. So I'm going to bump that up to 10 degrees to 81, and it moves me to 9.69. So essentially a 10-degree shift at 1,000 meters moved the bullet impact by about a quarter of a minute. So if you can shoot that well, then by all means, kind of know where you're at. If you need that quarter of a minute adjustment, definitely put it in there, you know. But if you don't, let's look at a full minute adjustment for a target. So I'll put it up to, let's say, 90 degrees.
And this is you guys and gals listening. This is all stuff that you can do at home. We're sitting on the couch with the wife, you know, different things like that. Try and figure some of this out, because I can guarantee one of the worst things that you can do in shooting, and it happens to all of us, it's happened to me, is letting stuff get in your head and having to change shit nonstop because you're worried about it. And at that point, you're not focused on, you know, the wind and the other variables that you really need to be focused on. So this is kind of cool to go down this road, though.
Yeah, so 20 degrees puts my impacts at 9.52 mils at 1,000 meters. So that's right about that minute there. And like Brian said, you know, you reference putting a layer on, taking a layer off. About 20, 30 degrees is where you're going to feel that temperature difference. So that kind of falls right in line with what he's saying is that rule of thumb.
No, hell, we got Ryan giving freaking Brian shit.
Is he on my spike shirt?
No, in here. They'll let anybody.
Yeah. I think this is a good time to just kind of touch on that what I was talking about before we actually started. Just everybody just understand what you can and cannot control. So with all the things that we have available to us right now, there's abundant opportunity to really know everything about your projectile, everything about your powder, everything about your casing, your primers, your weapon system, your scopes. We can know all those things. The more you can know, great. If you have the ability to know everything down to the most finite detail about it, great. Go ahead and log that. But then understand what you have to control. Okay, so we, as the shooters, are probably the most essential part of the shooter solution. We jerk the trigger. You know, we don't do proper follow through. We have bad parallax. All of these things that we can control, if we can remove ourselves as a variable in this shooter solution, that allows us the opportunity to go back to those smaller details and then adjust those as needed. So you're not just focusing on these small things, when in reality the bigger issue is not gripping the pistol grip properly and jerking the trigger, whatever it may be. Just understand where to put your focus initially, and then as you get better and better and better and start to know more about that weapon system and yourself, then you can start to break down to the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, and I've said that a million times. I see so many new shooters out there in the groups and the forums. Oh, I need the new FX trickler. I need the freaking really right stuffs. I need all that stuff, which is great. You know, it's a step in the right direction, but that's probably not where a lot of people need to focus. And I've had that. I try to preach that as much as I can. It's like, understand where you need to focus and then grow with it. Don't follow just because Jose B. C, whatever his name is out there telling everybody, oh, you have to have this to be a better shooter. That isn't necessarily true. In a ballistics lab, we always reloaded on freaking RCBS Charge Masters. There's nothing wrong with them. There's going to be more variable in me and the wind than there ever probably will be in that Charge Master. But going to the trickler, like you said, is just going to take some of those other variables out of the back of your mind and understand where you're going to go with it. But that's one of those things that you've just got to understand, especially as a new shooter, what you're going to focus on, and maybe even coming up with some steps on how to get better. You know, hey, I'm going to start by just shooting factory ammo. I'm going to go buy X gun. I'm going to shoot factory ammo. I'm going to understand start to understand the ballistics, start to understand the inputs, start to understand some of that stuff. Then I'm going to start reloading and, going down that freaking rabbit hole, which you guys are JD, all he shoots is freaking factory anyway, right?
Yep.
Freaking,
Well,
yeah. The AMU and some of them special guys, they probably got freaking sweatshops of people reloading.
I mean, it's technically factory.
I've loaded some of it. I know all about factory. I know what factory. Right. That's a good term for it.
Factory. And to kind of touch on what you're talking about, Cole, what we see with shooters, it's a few stages. You see a shooter who's really young, who's eager to learn a ton of stuff, but he doesn't know anything. And then they go into the next phase, which is now they've been taught on everything, and kind of like, you look at military combatives, just enough to get your ass kicked, kind of things like that. They know all this stuff, but they don't know how to apply it, and they know too much. And then once guys kind of really grow, they grow into, I guess, like the third phase, which is they know what they don't need to know. So they have a good concept of everything, but like Brian talks about headwinds and tailwinds, definitely check to make sure you have those on or off, but know how much a headwind or a tailwind is going to affect your bullet at 800 meters. And it might be like 0.02 mils, something like that. That being said, if you have it cranked up to 100 miles an hour, it's going to show something, but kind of know where everything applies and what you don't really need to worry about, kind of things like that. Like in talking with William, we're going over Coriolis too, and like at 800 meters, I was like, I don't teach guys to use Coriolis that much, and I showed him the numbers, and I was like, look, my windage component is off by 0.02 mils, well within my main point of impact. So kind of know where you can apply stuff and know where it's like, I don't need to worry about this right now.
And that's the great thing about this, is that if you do a little bit of looking and do a little bit of playing with your ballistic solvers, your kestrels, your applied ballistics analytics, whatever it may be, you can see yourself just how not necessarily insignificant, but just how little influence these things actually have. So, I mean, if Jeff's talking about a 0.02 for Coriolis at 800, if a guy can't hold half minute or can't call wind to within 3 miles per hour, Coriolis at that distance isn't going to do him any good. So just understanding what effects these things are going to have and at what distances makes your life so much easier, because you can stop dealing with all that stuff.
Yeah, and I preach it, and I'm going to preach it, and I'm going to keep preaching it. Understand what you need to look into, and then go through it. And that's kind of one of those issues I have going into the groups and forums. I'm like, I see so many people looking at the wrong thing, trying to focus on that, and it's craziness. But it's one of those things, we'll go. But I kind of want to bring you guys back at a certain point. I kind of want to go over, because there's a lot of things in the kestrels. There's a lot of things that I don't understand, and I'm going to be the first to admit it. And I know there's a lot of other people, and I know JD, we talked about this in one of our private groups the other day about understanding how to correctly input into your kestrel, because the freaking thing's 20 times smarter than I am. And then I just got the HUD. You can't see it, but I've got the kestrel HUD on that gun right there, and I'm still trying to figure out how the hell all that shit works. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's what I did with William. What was it, last Sunday? I grabbed my stuff, put the camera on my kestrel, and just put it on chat and open it up. It's like, hey, let's go through some inputs and talk about stuff. So we can definitely do that. That's pretty easy.
Yeah. So let's recap. Understand the variables, muzzle velocity. You went through all the steps of BC, DA, everything else. And anybody listening, if you want to play it back, we're going to have it, posted on iHeartRadio and all the Podbean and all the rest of them. But make sure you listen to it again if you don't understand it. And if you have questions, hit us up. You can come to the Long Range Addicts Podcast Facebook page. You can come to the Instagram page, leave messages. You can reach out, private message us, whatever you need to do. That's kind of the reason why this podcast was started, was to kind of bring it back down to everybody's level and learn and maybe grow, and hopefully all together we can do this. And it's exciting to have, knowledgeable people like these guys on that can kind of help us understand what the hell half of us are even talking about. But if the biggest point in my brain to take away from this is, your mind. Don't let everything that doesn't matter screw with your brain or screw with your mind, especially you don't want to match and everything else, because I've seen so many people that they'll have a bad stage, they'll input something wrong, and then the rest of the day is just completely gone, and it's getting in a mindset. And I've heard a few other podcasts talking about the mindset of the shooter and different things, and understanding what is important and what's not. And again, go play with your Kestrel, understand where it's going to start changing with you, depending on what cartridge you're shooting, bullet, everything else. Sit down on the couch and play with that instead of watching I Love Lucy reruns or whatever the hell you're watching. So is there
more time to do that right now.
Hey, I love Lucy. She was a freaking babe back in the day, man. Is there anything else you guys want to touch on before we get out of here?
You got anything, Jeff?
One of the things I talk to students about all the time is when we're shooting groups. We shoot groups because it gets us better at fundamentals. But when we shoot groups, and truing is no more than shooting a group at distance, your goal shouldn't be to shoot a tight group. Okay, I know that sounds kind of like, what's going on here, what's going on with that, because everyone wants to shoot tight groups. Your goal should be to do everything exactly the same for 5 shots. Because when you produce that level of consistency, you'll produce a good group. I bring it up in every class. I ask, hey, who's tried to shoot the tightest group out of everyone they're shooting against? More often than not, 1 or 2 guys raise their hand, and it's the rest of the class. It's like, no, I don't want to admit that that's me. And a lot of the times it's happened to everyone I've talked to. At some point, you'll shoot a group, and it'll get big, and you're like, man, F this, what's going on? And it'll get bigger. You're like, I just want to shoot a tight group, and it'll get bigger and bigger. And what happens is when you're trying to shoot that tight group, you're putting the cart before the horse. You're not focusing on what builds a tight group, and that's fundamentals. If you focus on building those fundamentals and producing consistent fundamentals, you'll shoot that tight group, which is Brian's, has talked about, will give you that good data down range to get you that good muzzle velocity when we're truing out.
Okay. Brian, you got anything?
Just piggyback off of what Jeff's saying. Be as repeatable as possible. Everything that we're doing in this sport, this job, whatever it may be, comes down to the repeatability. Being able to get behind the gun the exact same way, every single time. Slide that bolt forward, send the bolt forward, whatever it may be. Get into a proper position, align the sights on the target, squeeze the trigger, and do nothing to disturb the sights off of your intended point of aim while squeezing the trigger in the rear. That, just being as repeatable as possible in every way, shape, and form. But 2 big things, align the target, or align the sights on the target, at your intended point of aim, squeeze the trigger to the rear without disturbing those sights off your point of aim. That easy. That's how you get it. So thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I'd love to come back, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good seeing you again, man.
I know, man. It's been a while.
This is how everybody sees each other now. Now that we're social distancing, we get on freaking videos and look at each other through the video camera. That's how most people are seeing each other nowadays, for a freaking computer screen. So, Well, I appreciate it, guys. As always, I've learned something. And there's a lot of things that I need to work on myself, trying to become a better shooter, become a better hunter. That's the whole reason why I started doing it. And, calming nerves, different things like that, understanding, follow through, understanding all the steps of doing it. But I appreciate it. Look forward to next week, and we're building up a lot of good followers, a lot of good people commenting, getting a lot of great questions. and we're getting more and more companies reaching out like, hey, we want to be on it, talk about our stuff, which is awesome.
Mhm.
Hell, I'll learn something there too. So it's hard to keep track of all this new crap. Everybody keeps asking me, well, what
Yeah.
new ropes
Yeah,
do
it
I
really
use?
is.
Shit, I don't know. One that you can look through. All right, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks. You guys have a good night.
Thanks for having me, Cole.
Thanks again.
Don't be afraid to pipe up. Send us your questions or topics and we'll cover them on the show. Thanks for listening.